Okay, good to see all of you. We are holding on Daf Chaf Base, Amud Aleph, page 22a, and we started the Mishnah, started a little of the Gemara, talking about a sukkah that is midovlelas, and of course, midovlelas is the topic of discussion. What does the word midovlelas mean? And but whatever it means, the Mishnah says that it is kosher. Sukkah hamidovlelas is kosher. The Mishnah added a few other words. It said vishat silsa meruba mechamasa, if its shade is more than its sunlight. The Gemara will discuss if that is one case with the sukkah miduvlelas or if that's a separate thing. But the concept of it is that it has more shade than sunlight, and it is kosher. And then the Mishnah talked about a case where you have a very thick schach that's like a house, like you would have on a house, where you don't see the stars. And the Mishnah says there also is kosher. And the Gemara discusses, so what does midovlelas mean? And the Gemara says that there's two opinions. We have Rav's opinion that midovlelas comes from the word dal, poor. So poor, you poorly put schach on it, or there's a poor amount of schach on top of the sukkah. It's a minimal schach. And the way Rav would learn is that it's one case in the Mishnah. There is a very minimal amount of schach, but it is still some meruba mechamasa. So it's really one case that the Mishnah talks about where it's minimal amount of schach, but it does make the threshold of having more shade than sunlight. So it meets that requirement and it is kosher. According to Shmuel, the midovlelas comes from the word of bilbul, that it's disorderly. They're not near each other in an orderly fashion. Instead, one is above, one is below, and every other piece of schach is either above and every other one is below. And ultimately, you do have a sukkah here that has a lot of schach, but it's not exactly the shade that you would think is necessary for a sukkah. The reason why you don't have the shade necessary is because the sun is able to get through those areas where the schach is not covering. If you have one layer of schach, you have one layer, so then the sun can't get through. But if you have two layers of schach, so what ends up happening is the sun pierces through those holes, those large gaps of space. So the Mishnah, nevertheless, says that it's kosher. Sukkah midovlelas is kosher. And Shmuel, the way Shmuel understands it, at least the way we understood from Rashi, is that we are able to use imagination in order to make this sukkah kosher. And we say that we consider it, as long as it is within 3 tvachim, according to Abaye. We'll soon see Rava's interpretation. But Abaye says, it's within a certain measurement of 3 tvachim. So we're able to imagine that the sukkah, the schach, is all attached to the other schach. And if that's the case, then it has the majority shade, even though it really doesn't physically have majority shade. But we imagine that it has enough schach. It's an interesting halacha that we're going to be able to rely on this imagination. And according to Shmuel, you actually learn that silsa meruba mechamasa has a separate case. This case, it's more sunlight than shade, and yet it's kosher. And then Shmuel also says, the way he learns the Mishnah, that there's also a case of silsa meruba mechamasa that's kosher. It's two separate cases, and he has to learn that way according to the way Rashi's learning. I mean, at least the so far as we've seen the interpretation, that it makes sense. You have to learn that way, because the whole uniqueness of what Shmuel is telling us is that even though it's more sunlight than shade, it's kosher. Now that wouldn't fit with the next line of the Mishnah, Silsa Meruba Mechamasa, that's more shade than sunlight. In other words, if we're emphasizing that this Sukkah Medovlelas has more sunlight than shade, then you gotta understand the Mishnah as it's two separate cases, because the next case of the Mishnah talks about more shade than sunlight, and we've just emphasized that this case is more sunlight than shade. So they have to be two separate cases according to Shmuel. And what comes out is that we've got these two interpretations of what the Sukkah Medovlelas is, and the understanding according to Rav, I guess, is somewhat obvious to a lot of us. I mean, as long as it reaches that threshold, seemingly that's good enough. Silsa Meruba Mechamasa, it has more shade than sunlight. So the fact that it has empty spaces, I guess to us, Rav's opinion is not that impressive. It's not that innovative. But Shmuel's opinion is actually very innovative. He's telling us that we can use some type of imagination in order to kosher this sukkah, which really has more sunlight than shade. Now, Tosfos over here in the top Tosfos, he doesn't really like Rashi's interpretation. And one of the problems that he has is he says, what would happen? He says, think about the way Abaye explains the opinion of Shmuel. So if you have 3 handbreadths of space separating these cases, these two schachs, he says, then you're going to have, it's going to be invalid. If you don't have 3 handbreadths of separation, then it's going to be valid. He says, think about it. Why is it going to be invalid if you have a separation of more than 3 handbreadths? Why should that invalidate it? He says, think about the sun if it's exactly on top of this sukkah. So you have a sukkah, and the case, you have to picture the case well in order to understand this. What is the case? The case is you have one bamboo mat, let's say, up high, another bamboo mat low, another bamboo mat high. Oh, I don't know if you can see my hands here. You have like, let's say, 2 bamboo mats high, and then in between the two, and then next to the other one, you have 2 bamboo mats low. And we imagine that they're exactly level with each other. And if they're within 3 handbreadths of separation, that means it's not a big separation. We can imagine that they're all level. If it's much higher than if it's 3 handbreadths or more, then we do not we don't consider them level. So Tosfos asks, what would happen if the sun is exactly on top of this sukkah? Will it be more shade than sunlight? So Tosfos says, more shade than sun, you'll be fully shaded. If the sun is exactly on top, it's perfect. So you have some schach high up, some below. Okay, 3 handbreadths in between. Who cares? The sun is exactly on top. It's being blocked completely by these bamboo mats. You have good schach. Okay, there's some space in between, but the sun is exactly on top. He says that's a perfect sukkah. How could that? Well, why would that be non-kosher? And why would you call that more sunlight than shade? There's no way that it's going to be more sunlight than shade. That's going to be more. So you want to tell me the reason why it's going to be invalid is because there's more sunlight than shade? He says that's not a fact. It's not true. There's going to be more shade than sunlight, which basically means that Tosfos seems to understand this. And of course, we need to delve into what the depth of the argument is between Rashi and Tosfos, but on a very surface level, it seems that Tosfos understands the concept of shade, that we look at the sun above. We look at the sun as if it's on top. And in that scenario, this would be a good sukkah. And therefore, Tosfos has to come up with a different interpretation, because Rashi's interpretation would not flow. It sounds, again, I'm just mentioning on a surface level, Rashi doesn't seem to follow this issue, doesn't seem to see this as an issue. He sees it as, no, you have to look at the sun, even if it's not exactly on top. Yes, Victor.
So the question is, we're talking about an hour maybe of a day where that's the perfect timing, but what about all the other hours? In other words, in the morning, the sun comes up, it's in the low, and then by 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's already starting to. So now you have the sun coming in at angles instead of straight up. So the question is, how many hours a day does the sukkah have to be kosher? 1 hour or all the daylight hours? It's
right. So your question, you're basing your question on assuming that the mitzvah of being in a sukkah is to dwell in shade. And if that's so, then it would seem like you should always be in shade. And if not, it really shouldn't be a kosher sukkah. But if you see the concept is not that you're supposed to dwell in shade, but that the sukkah has to be a sukkah that gives shade. So then we can try to decide, so what does it mean, a sukkah that gives shade? Does it mean that it potentially gives shade when the sun is above it? Does it mean it majority of the time gives shade? Then you can debate and say, well, that's the argument between Rashi and Tosfos, that in other words, they're understanding it, not that it's a sukkah, not that you have to dwell in the shade, because there are going to be times where the sun is, beating down, and somehow the schach is not situated exactly perfectly, and you're sitting, or there's areas in the sukkah that's not fully shaded. There's some parts of the sukkah's kosher, even though some parts do not have, you're sitting in the sun. So the point is that you don't have to sit in the shade. It's about the sukkah being a sukkah that gives shade. And because of that, therefore, you could understand that there's an argument between Rashi and Tosfos over here. How do we understand the obligation of a sukkah? How do we see this obligation with regard to the sukkah being a sukkah of shade? Is it when the sun is right above it? That's called the sukkah that gives shade, or do we look at in general that majority, the common situation, which is probably much more when the sun is on the side than when the sun is above it? So that seems to be on a surface level, at least, the argument between Rashi and Tosfos. Tosfos has a different shot over here, and he says that the problem with the sukkah that's miduvleles, when it's more than 3 handbreadths. Again, let me just clarify. Yesterday we learned the Mishnah. We learned the argument of Rav and Shmuel in the Gemara, which explained what sukkah miduvleles means. And one of the meanings was that there is some of the schach above on a higher realm, and some of it is on a lower area, and you somehow have it up and down, and it ultimately covers your sukkah, but it's not on a level. It's not level. That's miduvleles. That was Shmuel. And then in Shmuel itself, we had Abaye, and we didn't yet get to Rava, but we did Abaye saying that there cannot be 3 handbreadths of separation between the sukkah that's on the upper level between the schach that's on the upper level and the schach that's on the lower. So that statement of Abaye is really where Tosfos is basing his problem on. When you, in other words, the problem with Rashi that Tosfos questions is that why should it be invalid if there's more than 3 handbreadths of space? You're going to call that more a sun than shade, because if you look at the sun when it's straight on top, it's not going to be more sunlight than shade. It's going to be more shade than sunlight. That's Tosfos' question. So what is Tosfos' answer? Tosfos' answer is that you're still going to have a problem. Not that the sukkah has too little shade, too much sunlight, but that you look at these 2 schachs each as entity of their own. And that's, I think, similar to what Ezra mentioned yesterday, that we were talking. I mean, we sort of understood it to be an issue of, is it a sukkah under a sukkah? Is it or is it a separation between the schachs? But Tosfos says you have to look at each of these schachs as their own entity, and each of these schachs do not have sufficient schach, and we can't combine them to be one schach. We have to look at them separately because they are at different levels and different ground. They're standing on different ground. So each one is understood, is seen as being separate from the other one. And because of that, we say, well, each one is a problem. It's more sunlight than shade. In other words, each one is not sufficient to be enough schach. If it would be 3 within 3 handbreadths, then we would say it's 1 layer of schach and it's sufficient. But if you look at them separately, then they're not sufficient. So this is the debate between Rashi and Tosfos, how to understand the problem here. Is it because the sun can get in when it's on the side, and even though it gets in when it's on the side, if it's within 3 handbreadths, we can imagine that it's 1, or is it that when it's within 3 handbreadths, we can say it's 1 layer, 1 level, and therefore it's of course kosher. When it's more than 3 handbreadths separation, then we see it as 2 separate schachs, and each one doesn't seem to be sufficient. Now, the thing is, it seems that Rashi's insight is a much bigger insight than Tosfos. And according to Tosfos, what is the Mishnah really telling us about this sukkah medovlelis? Just think about what. So the point that the Mishnah is really saying is that when you have 2 layers of schach, if there's a separation of 3 handbreadths, we have to look at each one separately, and we actually could invalidate the sukkah, even though you seem to have a lot of schach. But you could invalidate it. I mean, I guess it's an innovative idea, lechumra. In other words, Tosfos' insight is that it actually teaches us something that makes it more strict, something you wouldn't have thought of. You would think that what's wrong with this sukkah? If you look at the sun on top, if that's the way you're supposed to look at it, that the sun's on top, you would think, oh, this is a perfect sukkah. The sun is right above. You got 2 layers of schach. Okay, they're not exactly level with each other, but it's fine. Should be fine. Tosfos said, no. 3 handbreadths of space in between makes us look at each of these schachs as entities of their own, and we can't we can't consider it a kosher sukkah. Rashi's insight is the opposite. Rashi's insight is that actually you got more sunlight than shade, and it's kosher. We're going to imagine that the schach is that when it's within 3 handbreadths, that's the unique law that we see in Rashi, is that if it's within 3 handbreadths, guess what? You got more sunlight than shade, but so not only are you sitting maybe in the sunlight, but the sukkah is actually more sunlight than shade. It's a sukkah that's giving more sunlight than shade. And yet, Rashi says, guess what? Imagine. You can imagine that it's the schach is level with the other schach, and we consider it as if it's more shade than sunlight.
Rabbi?
So it's a sukkah that potentially that we can imagine that it has more shade than sunlight. So I'm just bringing out the insight based on how you learned the Mishnah. Yes, Moshe.
If the mats are within 3 handbreadths, even it depends on the size of the bamboo. Let's say a bamboo mat on another bamboo, but these are successive large bamboo chunks, and they're successive. One goes up, one goes down, one goes up, one goes down in a zigzag fashion. It's going to be polarized. The sunlight's going to be polarized. It's probably going to hit against the walls, and I don't think it's going to hit directly down, even if the sun is above the sukkah. But in the small, obviously, between two uniform mats that are right on top of each other, the bamboos, based on the size, if they're small, it's going to give more shade than sunlight. But in the larger bamboos, you're probably going to have more sunlight that's going to come in, even if they are within 3 handbreadths. It's not going to have the same effect.
You got a good point, Moshe. What you're asking really is that there's a lot of variables that are not mentioned here, meaning that how big is the sukkah? Is this is it 100-foot sukkah by 100-foot sukkah? Is this like a huge sukkah? And so each of these mats are 30 feet, and then if you have 30 feet so how far, and if so, what time of the day are we imagining that the sun is on? Are we thinking about if it's near sunset, or are we thinking it's like the middle of the day? Like, where are we imagining the sun to be? Because if the sun is just afternoon, so when the sun is just a little, away from the midpoint, it's still going to be more shade than sunlight. And however, if it's a very small sukkah, so then you do have, even if the sun is just a little bit away, but the sun will actually get through the holes. But if it's a very large mat, because a very large sukkah, so then you got to wait till the sun is, so there are a lot of variables here. And the concept, however, will apply even according to the way Rashi's learning. The point is that even though you will have scenarios where it's going to be more sunlight than shade, this is what Rashi is understanding the Mishnah to mean. Guess what? We're going to consider it kosher. So even in your bad case, meaning the case that's like the worst in your variables that you're seeing, what the worst case scenario would be, it's a small amount of schach, it's a small sukkah, and and they're not big mats, and so you got a lot of time that it's going to be more sunlight than shade, and even so, it's going to be good enough because we can imagine that the schach is going to be lowered to the to be level with the other stuff. Okay, so you got my answer, Moshe? Is that understandable?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I'm gonna just start reading. I'm gonna start with the beginning of the Gimel Mem, the beginning of the Gemara here, line 4, and this way you get it. You will get the whole flow. My midovlelas. So what does it mean, midovlelas? Again, we're at page 22a. We're on the 4th line. Starts the Gemara. The Mishnah said midovlelas is kosher, and then it mentioned silsam ruba mechamsa is kosher. It's mentioned the shade, more shade than sunlight is kosher, and the Gemara is discussing what is midovlelas. My midovlelas, Amar Rav. Rav says sukkah niya means a poor sukkah from the word dal. Shmuel Amar kana oilav kana yodei. Shmuel says a reed is above, a reed is below, is lowered, and that's what midovlelas means from the word bilbul. It's disorderly, and therefore it would be called midovlelas. It's similar to the word bilbul. That's Shmuel's understanding. Rav Tani Chada Ushmuel Tani Tarti. Rav learns that this is one case. The Mishnah talks about one case, meaning that even though it has additional words in the Mishnah that mention about more shade than sunlight, Rav understands that that's the same case, that it's a poorly covered sukkah, and yet it has enough to be, at least it's more shade than sunlight, and that's what Rav understands the Mishnah to be saying it's kosher. Shmuel Tani Tarti, Shmuel learns that these are two separate cases, and the first case is Sukkah Medovleles, that where you have above and below schach, and it's in that case it's really more sunlight than shade. And Rashi understood it to mean because the sun is gonna get in from the sides, and yet it's gonna be kosher. We're gonna learn that it has to be within 3 handbreadths, and then it's gonna be kosher. It's we imagine that the sukkah is all together, or the way Tues learned, that Shmuel learns that it's 2 cases. You got the sukkah meduvleles, where the schach is on 2 separate levels, and each one we look at as a entity of its own. But if it's within 3 handbreadths, we consider it one sukkah, and it's considered one layer of schach, and it's a sufficient schach to make it kosher. And what Shmuel basically is understanding the Mishnah to mean is, however, if it's more than 3 handbreadths, then it's going to be looked at as 2 separate schachs, and each one is not sufficient, and it won't be kosher. So it'll be considered that's more sunlight than shade. And then you have the second case where it talks about more shade than sunlight, and that's going to be kosher. Now, Rav Tani Chada, Rav Tani Chada, Rav learns one case, Sukkah meduvleles, my meduvleles, meduvdeles. What does it mean, meduvleles? It means poor, and Shatzilsa, meruba mechamsa, that it's more sail, that it has, even though it's very little schach, it has more shade than sunlight. It's kosher. Shmuel Tani Tarti, Shmuel learns that it's 2, my meduvleles, mebubeles. Meduvleles means that it's disorderly, but Tarti Kotani, and it's 2 separate cases. Sukkah mevubeles, Shera, that the first case was we have this sukkah with 2 layers of schach that are not in an orderly fashion, and the one is above, one is below. One layer is above, one layer is below, and they are separate locations, separate covering different parts of the sukkah, and it is kosher. And then you have the second case, which is silsa meruba mechamsa kshera, and if it's more shade than sunlight, it's also kosher. That's another case. That would be an additional case of the Mishnah. And so that's the Mishnah. That's the debate what meduvleles means. Rav and Shmuel, Amar Abaye. Now comes Abaye, and Abaye says, Loishanu ela she'ein bein zelazeh shloisha tefach. The Abaye says, we didn't learn this law that Shmuel says only in a case that kana oilev, kana yored, when you have one above and one below, it was not learned only in a case where there is less than 3 handbreadths. That's when it's kosher. Aval geish bein zelazeh gimel tefachim. But if you do have a separation between one of the layers and the other layer of 3 handbreadths, so you would not say the law of lavud, then it'll be pesula, it'll be invalid. And according to Rashi, the meaning behind that was that it's invalid because we can no longer say we imagine that the schach is all level and we imagine that it's more shade than sunlight. We can't do that. But because it's not lavud. You don't have this law of lavud that attaches it. Tues' shot is that if it's within 3 handbreadths, we're able to say it's one layer of schach and it's sufficient schach. And if it's 2 separate, if it's more than 3 if it's 3 handbreadths or more separation, then we can no longer say it's one schach. We look at it as 2 separate schachs, and each of them are insufficient. Amar Rava. Rava says, Afilu yesh bein zeh zeh shloisha tfachim, even if there are between one and the other, between these two layers of schach, even if there are 3 handbreadths, even then, nami lo yamaron, it was also not said, ella only she'ein begagoy tefach, if the roof does not have a handbreadth. Aval yesh begagoy tefach, but if the roof has a handbreadth, then it would be kosher, it's kosher. So Rava is building on what Shmuel said and what Abaye said. And he's saying, Abaye, you just explained Shmuel, and Shmuel explained the Mishnah, and it's all about what is the case that it's kosher, what is the case that it's not kosher. The case that Abaye had explained was that it's not kosher if it has 3 handbreadths of space or more, then it's not kosher. Rava says, no, even in that case, where it has 3 handbreadths or more, it's not always not kosher. There are going to be some times that it is kosher, even if there is a space, a separation of 3 handbreadths. And when would that be? That would be if that it would be kosher as if it has a tefach, a handbreadth of space. If the roof has a handbreadth of space, we will say this law, the amrinon chavoit rami. We will say this special law of chavoit rami. And what is this special law of chavoit rami? Chavoit rami means that we throw and we lower the thing to make it level. And this law is very similar to good achis, that we lower a wall to make it considered that it extends. So here also we can move the schach that's above, and we could say that it's level with the schach below. We throw it to be lower than where it is. And this law of chavoit rami, we will see, is mentioned in other places. We'll soon connect it to other halachos. But this law of chavoit rami, Rava wants to say it should apply here as well. What does that mean? That even though lavud, of course, works, but even when you don't have lavud, there are other halachic rules that sometimes will be able to kick in and make things work as well. So, of course, if it's within 3 handbreadths, you got lavud. You have the law that it's all considered attached, anything within 3 handbreadths. But if you don't have the law of lavud, there are times where you're going to be able to say chavoit rami. What are these times? That if, let's say, you just imagine
what's chavot rami?
That you throw down something above to fit in to what's below. So you have like empty spaces of the roof below, and you got exactly above it, above that empty space, you have some type of a beam or something. We can lower it and throw it down and say it fits right in there. That is exactly one layer of roofing. And so we're going to throw down the schach that's above. So we got a layer of schach above, and there's a hole right below it on the lower level of schach. And we're going to say drop it or lower it down and put it right in where there's that space. And we're going to consider it as if we got now a kosher sukkah. And earlier we wanted to say we have the law of lavud. Within 3 handbreadths, you could do that. We could attach it all, make it one layer of schach. And now we're saying, well, we have the law of chavoit rami that will do that, even if it's more than 3 handbreadths. So in other words, why do we want chavoit rami more than lavud? Because lavud only works up to 3. Once it reaches 3 handbreadths, about 9 inches and 9.15 inches, once it reaches that level, you no longer have the law of lavud. But Chavoit Rami works even if it's higher than that. However, the Rava tells us here, and we'll soon see it in the Mishnah, that the law of Chavoit Rami doesn't apply in all cases. It needs to fit. There's a certain limitation, qualification that it has to reach. It has to, and that is, it has to meet certain rule. That is that it has to at least be a handbreadth thick. If it's not a handbreadth thick, then we don't have this law of Chavoit Rami, at least the initial understanding of the Gemara. We'll soon see a contradiction about that, but that's the understanding of the Gemara, that it has to be a tefach thick. And so Rava says that it's not always invalid. Shmuel, Abaye, you want to say that this is always invalid? No. Even if it has 3 handbreadths, it's not always invalid. It's only invalid if it doesn't have a tefach of thickness to it, width of a handbreadth. But if it has that handbreadth of a tefach, then it actually will work, even if it's more than 3 handbreadths separation, because it has a certain thickness to it that allows us to say this law of Chavoit Rami. It's a discussion in the commentaries if Rava is arguing on Abaye or if he is explaining a qualification to Abaye's rule. Now, I don't know if you have it, but there's a question if it's Amar Rava or Rava Amar. I don't know if you see it on your Gemara, but some of the later Gemaras, they show that it's there's another girsa, another text that would be, it's either Amar Rava or Rava Amar, and that would be similar to what I mentioned yesterday, that when you have Amar Rava, that would imply like he might be explaining. Generally, he's explaining, he's qualifying something, and it's more like he's not arguing on a previous thing. But Rava Amar is the normal way to when it's a debate, when it's an argument. The funny thing is, in this Gemara, I don't know if it has to be that way, because our Gemara is a little different than the typical Gemara. Why? Because our Gemara, they're both explaining Shmuel. However, Rava is talking about Abaye's explanation on Shmuel. So Amar Rava seems that it could fit, even if he's arguing on Abaye, but he's still discussing Shmuel and explaining Shmuel's law, and he's saying, Amar Rava, that what you heard until now, what Abaye says, even though I'm arguing, I'm explaining Shmuel, and therefore, I don't know if it's such a proof the way it says it, Amar Rava or Rava Amar, if that would be a proof, because he could be the fact that he's explaining Shmuel allows it to use the term Amar Rava, not Rava Amar. Anyway, that's just a little technical detail for those that like a little dictum. But in any event,
Rabbi, what's the translation of the words Chavot Rami? Because I'm still I'm trying to have the translation trigger the meaning.
And the Steinsaltz does not help at all.
Well, the one I have, they're calling it the term, which in English, and I never heard of this, lower and cast. Lower and cast.
Well,
I don't even know what that means in English.
Rashi, they're just translating what Rashi says. It's Yored Zyrek. Well, let me just see what the word is.
Cast is like to cast down.
Yeah, to throw. Yeah. It seems that's how they translate it, that chavoid means to lower. Honestly, I'm not familiar with the word chavoid, so but Rama is like the word Rama Vayam. So Ram sometimes means to lift up, but Yara and Rama is sometimes, they both could mean to throw. So it could mean to throw. Rami could mean so it means to throw it down. You throw down the schach that's above, you throw it down. So you lower it, throw it down, and make it fit to be level.
I'm trying to find it in the text. Which section, which paragraph is this?
Oh, where it actually says the words Chavait Rami.
Yeah.
It's really like smack in the, well, no, it's a little before the midpoint of the page of 22a. It's a little before the midpoint.
I've
And
got
there's,
Rava,
you
I've
got it?
got Abaya, which I don't have the
Okay, so
page.
continue after Amar Abai, after Amar Rava. It's the last part of
Yeah.
his sentence. Chavoit Rami, and then there's a dot, some Gemaras. And it starts another Amar Rava. Amar Rava Mana. So there's two Amar Ravas. It's right before the second Amar Rava. It says Chavoit Rami. You see two
Okay,
Amar
I got it.
Ravas?
Yeah, I got it.
Oh,
It
Rabbi?
says it's lower and cast down the upper
Yeah.
level of the sukkah roofing down to the level of the lower sukkah roofing.
right.
Okay.
Right. So again, the word chavoit, I'm not sure the
So-
etymology of it, but Rami
Rabbi,
sometimes
isn't that
means
chavot? Isn't that
row.
like when we bang the aravot on the floor? Chavit is the
Yeah,
word. Like
yes. Yeah.
I don't know. It's
Yeah.
similar
Yeah.
or not?
That's it.
Rabbi,
Yes. Yes, Moshe.
Rami is when they drop it. But what about sliding a piece of stock in between where there's the open space? Does it have to be dropped, or can you just put some stock if there's an
No,
opening?
you're not doing anything physically. It's all imagination. This is all imaginative. Your schach is staying above where it is. But the Gemara is telling us that we're able to the Mishnah, the innovation of the Mishnah is that guess what? There's special halachic laws that allow us to imagine it as if it was cast down. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Now, Amar Rava. Okay, so we basically have Rava's statement here about a new option of how to kosher this sukkah. We've got number one, the sukkah is kosher because it's within 3 handbreadths. Number two, even if it's not within 3 handbreadths, it could be kosher if the schach has a width of a handbreadth. It's more than more than tefach, more than 3 point something inches, and that would allow it to be thick enough to be able to use this law called chavoit ram. Amar Rava mano amino. From where do I say this? Where am I getting this from? Mano amino law. From where am I saying this law? How do I know that it needs to be is but tefach rinan chavoit rami, that if it has a handbreadth, you say chavoit rami, v'chiles ba lo yamrinan chavoit rami, and if you don't have a tefach, a handbreadth, you can't say chavoit rami. Where do I get this law from? Now, he brings a Mishnah, Ditnan, because we learned in a Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Ayalais. The Mishnah in Ayalais says that Ditnan, we learned in a Mishnah, Kaires habayis v'ho'aliyah. When you have beams of a house and an attic, she'ein aleihem ma'aziv, they don't have on them the roofing, the full roofing. And the meaning behind this is that, my understanding is they didn't finish building the house yet. So it's in the middle, it's in a stage where you've got beams, but you don't have the full roof. And so you have, the way they would build it was, of course, the walls are walls as usual, but the floor to the floor to the I should say the roof of the first story, and then which is a floor to the second story, and then the roof to the second story. So there are just some boards going across. the boards going across, you've got the boards on the first for the first story for their roof and the floor for the second story, those boards. And then you've got boards that are a roof for the second story of the house. Now, are these boards either flush with the boards right below them, or are they the exact opposite? They're in between the empty holes of the boards that are covering the first story. The boards that are covering the second story, they might be every other. In other words, the space in between the boards that are like the serving as a partial roof for the first story has space in between each of these boards. And that space in between each of the boards is where the second story has boards, and that would be another option. So you might have the boards exactly corresponding to the lower story boards, or you could have the boards that they're not corresponding to them. They're the exact opposite. They're exactly in corresponding to the empty space that's in between the boards. Yes, David.
I've got a picture.
Okay, if you want. Yes.
Yeah. Also, the way they're wording it in my English is that there's no plaster on the boards yet.
Right.
That's
Right.
the idea.
So,
The full roofing. You don't have proper roofing yet. Yeah.
okay. It's
Did everyone
under
understand it
construction,
this way?
which
Did my explanation
Yes,
fit with the way the picture looks? Okay.
yes.
So these are the two options. One is called mechuvanois. It's exactly corresponding. And the other way is that it's kivein hatachtonis. It's in between. The upper ones are they're covering the space that's in between the lower ones. Okay. So these are the two cases that we're going to talk about. All right. If you want to stop the share screen, David, now we can look in the Gemara. Thank you, David, for showing the picture. So the Mishnah continues, and it says, "Vehein mechuvanos," if they are corresponding to the lower ones, tuma tachas achas mehen. If you have impurity under one of them, tachas achas mehen, excuse me, if you have impurity under one of these beams, so like let's say you have impurity in the first story, and it's under one of the beams, not under the empty space, it's under one of the beams. So the law is tameh. It is impure. What's impure? Everything under that beam, that board, is impure. Bein hatachtoina le'elyoina. If the impurity is between the lower boards and the upper boards, which means it's in the second story. In the second story, you have impurity, which means a piece of a dead body, or it's kezias, the size of an olive of a dead body, and so it's between the first story and the second story. Beinehen tameh, anything in between these two boards, meaning the board that's the roof for the first story and the board that's the roof for the second story, anything in between that, it's considered tameh. It's considered impure. Why? Because we have a oihel, a tent above these impurities. The one, when you have the impurity in the first story and it's below one of the boards, that board is considered an oihel. It's a tent. An oihel does two things. It shares the impurity with anything else that's under that same tent, and it also blocks the impurity from going above it. That's what an oihel does. It accomplishes two things. So the same thing would apply if the impurity is on the second story. It is blocked from going above it because you have a tent over it, and it does not and it spreads impurity. It also spreads impurity to anything under the same tent, and it actually will block the lower board, will block the impurity from going below it. Now, what happens al gabe ho el yoina? What happens if the impurity is above the top leaf? Maybe you could call it the top board. What happens if the impurity is above the top board? Kenegda ad l'rakia tame. It's going to be impure from that all the way up because there's no tent to block it. Now, the Mishnah continues and says, Hayu ha'el yoinais kevein hatachtonis. What happens if the upper boards are corresponding to the space in between? They're not corresponding to the lower boards. They're in between. They're corresponding to the space in between the boards below. So they're corresponding to the empty space. So then we're going to see here that we're going to say the special law of Chavoit Rami. What is the case? So here the boards are basically similar to our sukkah that we've been talking about, a sukkah miduvlelas, very similar. You've got boards that are on the second story that are corresponding to the empty space on the lower story, similar to our sukkah, which is sukkah miduvlelas, where you have schach that's corresponding to the empty space, very similar type of thing. And what is the law? So tuma tachtehen, if you have impurity under them, under one of these boards, so the law is tachas kulan tame. The tuma is going to spread to the entire area. Why? Because we say this law of Chavoit Rami, that everything is lowered down, and it comes out that you've got a full tent here. And the elevated boards, which means the ones from the second floor, they are lowered to fill up all the holes in the lower one. And we look at the entire thing as if it's one oihel, and the impurity spreads throughout that entire first floor. And
the second floor,
the entire area.
The second
What?
floor also.
Well, to some extent, because if you have something that's under the empty space, that's, let's say, above, that's in the empty space, not exactly. You know what I'm saying? Like there could be stuff above the beams of the first floor that's under the sky. And so will we say that that is also tummy? Well, it deserves to be discussed. But anyway, the tuma tachtehen is tachas kulan tummy. Everything becomes impure. And we say this law of Chavoit Rami. Al gabehen, what happens if there is impurity on top of them? So either on top of the beams that are below, meaning on top of the first floor ceiling beams, or on top of the attic beams. So then mashenimtza kenegda ad l'rakia tame, it makes impure anything above it. So anything above it will be impure because there is nothing that's really blocking it from being metame, from being metame. There's no oihel that blocks it.
Rabbi,
Yes, though.
can you mute the background noise?
Yeah. Vitani Allah, and we learned about this in a Tosefta. It was taught about this. Bamed dvarim amurim, when does this apply? Bizman sheyesh bahen kafach. When they have the size of these boards are a handbreadth, beinehen pesach tafach, and below and in between them is also an opening of a handbreadth. So you have at least a handbreadth size of the board. meaning the lower boards have a handbreadth, and the in between them there is a handbreadth of space, and by having it that way, situated that way, you could you could then lower the upper boards to be considered that they're flush with the empty space, and that they fit right in, and they will make the whole area into one oyel, one tent. And the tumah, the impurity, will spread throughout. Now, what happens if they don't have that amount of space? They don't have an opening of a handbreadth, which basically means that the upper boards also don't have an opening of a handbreadth, don't have the size of a handbreadth, because everything, it's corresponding. So when we say that the lower boards are a handbreadth, and in between them there's a size of a handbreadth or more, so that means that the upper boards are also that same size as what's in between these lower boards. So when we say that the lower boards have less than a handbreadth, that means the upper boards also have less than a handbreadth of space. And in that case, we are not going to say chavoit rami. Because there's no handbreadth, doesn't have the size of a handbreadth, the width of a handbreadth. So tuma tachas achas mehen, if there's impurity under one of these lower beams, so tachteha tame, what's in between, what's under that beam, tachteha is tame, because the lower beams are a tefach, they're a handbreadth, so therefore they could be considered a noyel. The upper beam is not a handbreadth. The lower beam is a handbreadth. So what's under that lower beam, that one beam, whatever's under it is also going to be a tameh, but whatever's outside of that is not going to be tameh, because there's an oil, there's a tent over that impurity. And so bottom line is that in order to say chavoit rami, we need the top beams to have a handbreadth of space, to be a width of a handbreadth, in order to be able to say chavoit rami. Beinehen, now what happens? Beinehen, if you have vessels that are in between them, Beinehen means, it's a little confusing here, but Beinehen means that when you have the beams corresponding to each other, and there's impurity under the bottom beam, so what's in between the beam and the next beam above it, the Beinehen is going to be tahor, and also the al gabehen, and even if in a case where it's not corresponding, but what's on top of the lower beam is also going to be tahor. Both of these cases, it's tahor, because the lower beam is called choitzetz b'fnei hatuma. It separates from the impurity, and therefore it blocks the impurity from making anything above it impure. Instead, everything is pure above it, whether the top beam is exactly corresponding or it's not. Either way, whatever is above that lower beam is going to be tahor, is going to be pure. Alma ki is bei tefach amrinan chavoit rami. We see from here that when you do have a width of a tefach, like in the top beams, you have that width. Amrinan chavoit rami. We could say that we lower them and make it into one tent, into one covering. V'chiles bei tefach, and if it doesn't have a handbreadth of space, lo yamrinan chavoit rami, we will not say chavoit rami. Shma mino, Rava says, I rest my case. Shma mino, we hear from this that is, you see from this Mishnah, this law of chavoit rami, which we want to say applies to Sukkah as well. We're going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.